I don't think anything's off the table at this point.
The Trump doctrine is that America's first.
A United Airlines passenger dragged off of an overbooked flight.
It was pretty shocking when they're actually grabbing him, pulling him off the plane.
Oh my God, look at what you're doing to him!
This is New Day with Chris Cuomo and Allison Camerata.
Okay, so that story is getting a lot of buzz. Why did the airlines have to manhandle that passenger and drag him from the plane? Though he did refuse to get off, we have two witnesses who were on that plane coming on to tell us what they saw.
And it winds up getting complicated. What are your rights as a passenger? What is the airline allowed to do? And then, of course, what should they have done?
Right. All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to your New Day. We do have breaking news for you. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson on his way to Russia. But he had a clear message for them before leaving from the G7 summit. Tillerson calling on the Kremlin to drop its support of Syria's brutal dictator.
The Kremlin says relations with the U.S. are the most difficult since the end of the Cold War. What will they say about what they did or did not know about that chemical attack in Syria when the Russian and United States heads of state meet? It is a critical day of diplomacy on this day 82 of the Trump presidency. CNN has correspondents across the globe. Let's begin with Nick Robertson, live from the G7 in Italy, and that got real important real fast.
Yeah, it really did, Chris. What Secretary Tillerson has learned from his allies here is there's support for the United States strikes on Syria. There's support for existing sanctions on Russia. There isn't support, however, for more sanctions to be put on Russia. The Italian foreign minister here explaining it's better to be negotiating with Russia rather than pushing Russia into a corner. Secretary Tillerson here saying very clearly Russia has to make a choice, that its current position means it is supporting Iran, it is supporting Assad, it's supporting Hezbollah, and it needs to come across the table, if you will, and support the international community in getting a ceasefire and in bringing a political transition in Syria. Tillerson saying that until now, Russia has been falling short on its obligations.
It is also clear Russia has failed to uphold the agreements that had been entered into under multiple UN Security Council resolutions. It is unclear whether Russia failed to take this obligation seriously or Russia has been incompetent. But this distinction doesn't much matter to the dead.
The bigger picture right now, if you look at this collectively, is that the Trump administration is now, if you will, caught up with the Obama position on Assad, a transition to get him out of power. Of course, they have now the added heft that they're willing to use military strikes, and it's all in Tillerson's hands as he heads to Moscow. Allison?
Okay, Nick, thank you very much for that. Secretary of State Tillerson is on his way to Moscow as we speak for that high-stakes meeting with Russia's foreign minister. Relations between the two countries, as you just heard from Nick, are more tense than ever in recent memory. CNN's Michelle Kaczynski is live in Moscow with more. So, Michelle, tell us the latest from there, and has there been any reaction yet to what Secretary Tillerson has already said?
Yeah, not in direct response to his comments, which just happened. But any minute now, we're expecting to hear from Vladimir Putin. He's going to be he's getting out of a meeting with his Italian counterpart. So it's really about their meeting, but he's bound to take questions or at least make some comment on the state of this relationship. And in fact, he may not even meet with Secretary of State Tillerson when Tillerson arrives here. And if he doesn't, that in itself speaks volumes about how things are right now. I mean, we've been hearing extremely strong statements from Russia over the last few days, calling the U.S. strikes in Syria an act of aggression, that they're inadmissible, that they violate international law, and that the U.S. is getting closer, they said, to clashes with Russia. So there's been this reporting that the meeting between Secretary Tillerson and Russia, whether it's just the foreign minister or whether it's Vladimir Putin, is going to be tough. Something like an ultimatum that he's going to tell Russia that it needs to back away from Assad and accuse Russia in complicity in that chemical attack in Syria. But when Tillerson was asked exactly those questions, what are you going to say? Is it going to be an ultimatum? Is Russia complicit? He's been far, far less committal. He says there is no hard evidence at this point of Russian complicity, that he's going to call on Russia to change course in Syria. Chris?
Michelle Kaczynski, thank you very much from the reporting in Moscow. So we know where the allies stand on what is going on in Syria, even where Russia seems to stand. But what is America's position on Syria? The White House seems to keep vacillating between motivating Assad's exit, defending the people, but from what keeps changing. And then we have Trump's Stay Out, America First motto. CNN's Joe Johns live at the White House with more. And all of this theoretical discussion comes around factual disputes about what Russia may have known about the attack in Syria.
That's certainly right. The big question, of course, is what did Russia know? What we know, in fact, is the United States at least alerted Russia to the fact of the strikes, but not a whole lot more than that, quite frankly. The other big question, I think, this morning is about Syria and essentially where the United States government is headed on policy towards Syria. On the one hand, the president may have demonstrated, if you will, some resolve to act in the interest of the United States when he believes the United States interest is threatened. On the other hand, this administration is still struggling to come up with what could be called a coherent policy towards some of the current foreign hotspots.
If you gas a baby, if you put a barrel bomb in to innocent people, I think you will see a response from this president.
White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer telling reporters that another chemical attack or use of barrel bombs could result in more missile strikes.
When you watch babies and children being gassed and suffer under barrel bombs, you are instantaneously moved to action.
This would mark a dramatic escalation of U.S. action, considering that Assad's regime has dropped 495 barrel bombs last month alone, according to the Syrian Network for Human Rights. Hours later, the White House walking back this apparent red line, saying Spicer meant to signal that the president is never going to rule anything out. Further muddying the waters, this interventionist comment from Secretary of State Rex Tillerson at the G7 summit in Italy.
And we rededicate ourselves to holding to account any and all who commit crimes against the innocents anywhere in the world.
Very different from Trump's America First vision.
We're not just going to become the world's policemen running around the country, running around the world.
The Trump administration's stance toward Assad also remains unclear.
I can't imagine a stable and peaceful Syria where Bashar al-Assad is in power.
Spicer seemingly taking the position stated by UN Ambassador Nikki Haley on Sunday.
Regime change is something that we think is going to happen. It's going to be hard to see a government that's peaceful and stable with Assad.
Which was the opposite of statements from Secretary Tillerson.
Once we can eliminate the battle against ISIS, conclude that, and it is going quite well, then we hope to turn our attention to achieving ceasefire agreements between the regime and opposition forces.
I think they're still searching, frankly, for a policy and for a strategy.
Meantime, Syrian warplanes are back in the sky, taking off from the airbase hit by the U.S. with dozens of cruise missiles. The Pentagon claims the strikes caused 20% of Syria's operational aircraft to be destroyed. But two senior military officials tell CNN it was 20 planes, not 20%.
The president did ask for a complete damage assessment on the bombing run last week. The Pentagon has not held a briefing since Friday. Military and security matters will be on the president's mind today. He's meeting with his national security advisor, H.R. McMaster. As well, he's expected to have dinner with some top military leaders tonight. Chris and Allison.
Okay, thanks so much, Joe. We have a lot to discuss. Let's bring in Ron Brownstein, CNN senior political analyst and senior editor of The Atlantic, Tony Blinken, CNN Global Affairs analyst and former Deputy Secretary of State and former Deputy National Security Advisor, and CNN military analyst Cedric Leighton. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. Tony, I want to start with you. How is this conversation between Secretary of State Tillerson and Sergei Lavrov or whomever he ends up meeting with in Russia going to go, particularly since just before he got on the plane to Russia, he's currently in the air, he said Russia has failed to uphold their agreements to secure the chemical weapons in Syria, and for that, they have to be held accountable.
Well, I think Secretary Tillerson is exactly right. He said the right thing heading to Russia. The fact is there was an agreement brokered by Russia in 2013 to get all the chemical weapons out. We succeeded in getting a lot of them out, but obviously we didn't get everything. And Russia has failed to uphold an agreement that it brokered. And I think the Secretary is right to put them on the spot, to make it clear to the world that Russia, either by failing to do what it needed to do or by actually being complicit, bears some responsibility for these attacks. And I think going forward, he needs to make clear that we'll continue to hold Russia accountable if Assad continues to use chemical and biological weapons. But the thing, Allison, is this. We hear all of these different conflicting voices within the administration over exactly what the policy is. And I'm reminded of an old hit song from a few years ago, Until I Hear It From You. We need to hear from the president. The president needs to tell us what the policy on Russia is generally, and also exactly what we're trying to do in Syria. The greater the precision, I think the more comfort people will have. As it stands now, we're just hearing too many different voices saying too many different things.
Well, Ron Brownstein, what's your read on that? Interesting to note, President Putin just came out, addressed his people, did not mention the United States or the attacks in Syria, taking a page out of the Trump book, so to speak, there. But what do you make of the president's reluctance here in the United States to address this mixed messaging? Is it because he was so demonstrably opposite where they seem to be right now during the campaign with America first and stay out?
I think what has happened in Syria is a direct challenge not only to his remarks during the campaign about Syria, but to the broader effort to rethink relations with Russia. If you go back to the campaign, if you remember, the jewel in the crown that was supposed to come from a better relationship with Russia was cooperation against ISIS, particularly in Syria. Look at the language in the very first presidential debate, where he said, "Wouldn't it be great if we were working with Russia against ISIS?" And I think what that always kind of miscalculated was that while Russia did have an interest in dislodging ISIS, it had a greater interest in reinforcing Assad. And now that we are, understandably drawing a civilizational red line against the use of chemical weapons, the divergence between our interest and their interest in Syria is more apparent, and that kind of makes it more unlikely that we will get the kind of cooperation that he talked about during the campaign. Having said all that, it is not clear that Putin wants to go all the way down the road in defending everything that Assad has done or might do. So there might be some opportunities there. But again, the kind of broad cooperation that he talked about in the campaign, I think, is one of the things that have been exploded by the events of the last week.
Cedric, another thing that is confusing is they're trying to justify what the motivation was for the missile strike from the U.S. to that airbase in Syria last week. It was popular, according to polls, with voters, but today you hear them using lots of different justifications for it. So was it national security? Was it because they broke their chemical weapons agreement? What do you think it was about?
I think, Allison, it was a combination of several factors, among them a national security interest, the nonproliferation of chemical weapons, for starters. Number two, though, it is also a way in which to convey a message, in a way in which to say, there is a red line here. They're not using that term, but we're basically saying we have a red line and we're not going to let you cross it. Now, some of the mixed messaging here could actually be used to the administration's advantage if they choose to do that.
Meaning keep them guessing.
Exactly. And that goes in line with what President Trump said during the campaign. I don't want to reveal exactly what I'm going to be doing here. I want to keep the adversary guessing. And what I see happening here is, first, they want to take care of ISIS first. I think that's pretty clear from what Secretary Tillerson has said and what some other things have happened. But the other part of it is they also want to make sure that they can pivot. Once they take care of ISIS, they want to then pivot and take care of Assad. How they do that, that becomes a huge, huge issue then. And that is, I think they're trying to figure out how to do that. They're trying to get Russia on board, and that becomes the really hard part. How do you convince somebody that you're putting into a corner? How do you get them to be on your side?
It may have been a message, Cedric, but you spend 59 Tomahawk missiles, about $100 worth of $100 million worth of munitions. You want to get something done. The results we're hearing 20% of the Syrian Air Force, or 20% of the 7th Wing Division of their Air
Or
Force,
20 planes.
or 20 planes. What seems more likely? And, you know, from your time in the military, that doesn't sound right. Somebody's got it wrong here about what the number is.
Sure. So what's probably right is this: 20% of the Syrian Air Force is wrong. That's not going to happen in a strike of this type and of this magnitude and with that weapon system. What is possible is 20% of the 7th Wing or 20% of what was on that airbase, because those two things mean the same thing, basically. And so if you cut out 20% of the operational aircraft on a base, that is a significant factor from an operational standpoint, but it doesn't kill the base, and it doesn't kill their ability to fly from that base. So they're sending a message, the Syrians are sending a message back to us saying, we can still fly from here, so your strike wasn't as effective as you like to tell people it is. But the fact of the matter was, it did do some damage. It did allow for there to be a pause in the use of chemical weapons. But it also was one of the key things that really brought about a change in the dynamic. So I think what the administration was trying to do was change the dynamic, and in that sense, they have a possible opening to make that happen.
So, Tony, no Pentagon briefing since this happened on Thursday night. And, you know, as Cedric's been saying, they don't want to telegraph to the enemy what they're doing. They don't like to talk about their plans, but
Although
they're also
they told
not...
Russia that they were going to launch the missiles.
That's true. They did give that, you know, international courtesy, or call it whatever you want. But they're also keeping Americans in the dark here about these questions that we're all wrestling with this morning.
Yeah, and again, Allison, I think it comes back to the president. It would be good if he spoke to the American people about this. They want to know, we want to know how he sees this, what he's thinking, what the goals are going forward, both with Syria specifically and then more broadly with Russia. We're seeing Russia make a lot of mischief in very different parts of the world right now, whether it's in Syria and its complicity with Assad, whether it's in Ukraine and Belarus near its own borders, whether it's in places from Libya all the way to other places around the world. And a lot of this is just to challenge us. I also think that Mr. Putin is trying to take people's attention back home away from their own problems. You saw these very significant protests in Russia just a little over a week ago. Making trouble somewhere else is a good way of distracting people's attention. We need to be clear that we're going to stand against that when we have to, even as we look to see if we can find ways to cooperate where we can. But again, this all comes down to the president giving us some clarity about what his approach to Russia is, as well as to Syria.
Ron, let's go back to the role of the president again. It seems to be looming large here. The silence seems to be deafening. He put out a tweet with an awkward explanation of why you don't bomb runways, and there's no evidence that the military wasn't trying to take out the runway. It just didn't happen. On the messaging here, how important is it for the president to be out front, and what is the likelihood of where he'll come down on this?
I think I agree with Tony that it's extremely important, and I don't think it is 100% clear where he will come down on it, given both the dissonance within the administration that we've heard from different voices, but also the distance that all of this conversation has traveled from where he was during the campaign. Don't forget, at points during the campaign, he even suggested that we could work with Assad against Russia. And going back to Allison's point, it is true that there is majority public support for this action, but it is at the lowest end we have seen. Gallup reported of any military action that it has seen, essentially only about half the country saying they support this, and it dividing along familiar lines, with the groups that are skeptical of President Trump expressing skepticism of this. In the Gallup polling, his approval rating remains at 40% in the 3 days after the attack as the 3 days before. That's very unusual, and that is a constraint on his ability to act and mobilize public opinion. The doubts about him are still there among the people who are skeptical.
That's good context, Ron. Thank you for that. Thank you, panel, for all of your expertise on this.
You're saying during the campaign it was different. Last week it was different, the White House position on Assad, than it is right now. So how should the Trump administration deal with adversaries like Russia, Syria, North Korea? We're going to ask a Republican congressman about what he wants to see happen next.
Plus, 2 passengers who witnessed this on a United flight.
Come on.
Okay, that was a fellow passenger being dragged off the plane. Why did this have to happen? What did they see? They're going to give us more context.
It is also clear Russia has failed to uphold the agreements that had been entered into under multiple UN Security Council resolutions. It is unclear whether Russia failed to take this obligation seriously or Russia has been incompetent. But this distinction doesn't much matter to the dead.
That was Secretary of State Rex Tillerson taking a hard line on Syria ahead of his meeting today in Moscow. Let's discuss this and more with Republican Congressman Ted Yoho of Florida. Good morning, Congressman.
Morning, Allison. How are you?
I'm doing well. Before we get to what's going to happen today, let me just ask you about what happened with the U.S. missile strike on Syria. What did the U.S. accomplish with that strike?
I think the best thing they did is they sent a strong signal that enough's enough. You know, there's been over 480,000 Syrians killed, whether at the hands of Assad or whether it was the rebels or ISIS or the coalition forces. This has been going on for 6 years. The world stood by idly. You saw a lot of rhetoric, but no action. I think this was a very decisive action. And along the lines of Rex Tillerson, when we had the agreement that Syria would give up these chemicals of mass destruction, and they didn't do them all, and Russia was supposed to certify that, and even John Kerry signed off, said they're 100% gone, and the Americans are the ones that paid for this. So that means either Assad was reproducing them or they didn't turn them all over. And so it's something that they broke the accord that we had, and we have to stand up and do something about that.
But so this was just a signal. We didn't go after any of the stockpiles, if they still have them, of chemical weapons. We didn't even disable the airport.
Right. And I think that's a very strong signal that, you know, we've got very pinpoint targeting. We could do more damage if needed. Hopefully we don't have to, and that Assad got the message. And, you know, let's bring the civil war to an end. It's displaced as many people as before World War II, you know, with the refugees around the world. It hasn't just destabilized Syria, it's destabilized the whole, you know, world, with refugees going everywhere.
And Congressman, just help me understand, why do you feel so strongly about taking decisive action now and helping to bring the Syrian civil war to an end now, when President Obama was in office, you felt completely differently? Let me read a statement that you gave in 2013
I did, yeah.
about this. You said, while the President, Obama, aims to intervene in Syria's internal conflict, I maintain it is neither the role of the United States federal government to do so, nor the responsibility of the American taxpayer to fund such an unconstitutional act. The Founding Fathers never intended an act of war to be conducted without the consent of Congress, and if we are to engage in military aid or action in Syria, we are engaging in an act of war against a sovereign nation. What's changed?
I feel the same. The things that have changed are a couple things. One is, you know, this is 6 years later, and you've got the 480,000 people that have been killed. This, we sat down with Dennis McDonough, who was the chief of staff with President Obama, they had an open-end policy. They wanted to do no-fly zones like we did in Libya. That led to a failed state where ISIS is recruiting and training in Libya. It's one of the worst areas on the planet for ISIS recruitment. So President Obama wanted to have an open end. In fact, I asked Dennis McDonough, how long was this operation going to last? He says, we're not sure, maybe 10 years. And I asked him how much it was going to cost. It was going to be over $1 billion a month is what their estimate was.
Okay, so
it was engaging us long-term in the Middle East.
Congressman, because do you know what the Trump policy would be in Syria? I mean, when you're saying it's time for this brutal civil war to end, how long would you be in? How much would you spend?
Again, this is 6 years later. There's
4 years. I mean, this was 2013 when you said it. We're 4 years later.
Right.
Go on.
It's 4 years later. 480,000 people have been slaughtered over there. And so what President Trump did was an immediate attack. He says enough's enough. I am still of the mindset that we are not going to commit. What we did is, I feel, was right at the verge of an act of war. We attacked a sovereign nation. And so for him to go any further, he's got to come to Congress. We have to talk about this. I'm not willing to commit American taxpayers' money anymore, or American troops on the ground in another Middle Eastern country.
Right, but
I mean, all we have to do is look at Afghanistan and Iraq.
Sure,
and
but
I
no
don't want to go
taxpayer
down this
money.
path.
How are you going to stop the brutal civil war that you're talking about?
Well, let's hope, as a world community, that this brings that to an end, to where they pivot and they make changes in Syria. Something had to be done. You know, are we going to sit here and watch another Auschwitz, you know, where millions of people got killed as the world stood by?
Sure,
this is something we've got to help bring to an end.
Okay, but are you saying that one airstrike on an airbase that damaged 20 airplanes is going to bring the civil war that Assad's been waging to an end?
Nobody knows that. Let's hope
you think
that
it's possible?
just changes the dynamics. Yeah, I think it's possible for sure.
You think that President Bashar al-Assad was so struck by what happened on Thursday with the missile strike, the next day, virtually on Saturday, those planes were back in the air again, bombing innocent civilians in his country? It doesn't seem, if that's what you think the message was, it doesn't seem he received that message.
Well, let's see if there's chemical weapons used. This is, again, something that the world community has said chemical weapons are off the table. We've had legislation in to stop the barrel bombs that he's used on his own people with chlorine gas, and we've sent this message through the committees of foreign affairs. It's gone through Congress.
Okay, so if a barrel bomb is
that,
used again, if he uses a barrel bomb, do you support President Trump again striking Syria?
I support President Trump coming to Congress to ask for approval, and then the Congress talks about this, we debate it,
and
you
then
would
we give that approval
before this. Again, I have to look at the facts. You're looking at a hypothetical in the future. I have to see what the conditions are.
Well, I mean, I'm looking at the past. He has used barrel bombs. There's no promise that he won't again. So you're saying that you are now ready. You feel differently than you did in 2013. You are now ready to grant some sort of permission for further military action against Syria.
No, ma'am, that's not what I'm saying. I said I'm willing to debate it and look at the cause. How long is this going to last? What kind of commitment are you looking from the United States? Where's the rest of the world community? Doesn't everybody around the world that has been affected by the influx of refugees, don't they have something to bring to the table on this? Where's Europe? Where's the EU? Where's Germany? You know, so I think we need to have that discussion before we go any further and commit America anymore. But I think that was a strong signal. It was a decisive signal sent by our president that says this has to be brought to an end. This conflict has destabilized the whole world. And then we've got North Korea to think about, too.
Indeed, we do. You have 10 seconds. Very quickly, what's the answer in North Korea?
North Korea, again, we've got a fleet out there to show the strength of the United States, that this is a new president. This is a new, new narrative coming out of America that, you know, you can't go around flaunting, you know, nuclear power, that you're going to destroy America, you're going to destroy South Korea, you're going to put Japan at risk. These are regimes that have to fall into line to the world community of being good actors. And if you're working to destabilize the world like that, something has to be done. And when there are direct threats at us, the 23 million people 30 miles south of the DMZ in South Korea, or 28,000 troops in South Korea, I think we should show that we have force and we're serious about what we do.
Congressman Ted Yoho, thank you for being on New Day.
Sure, Allison.
Chris.
All right, so there's this political intrigue question surrounding Washington. Will he stay or will he go? I'm not talking about the song from The Clash. Steve Bannon. Can he exist with the other man you see on your screen, Jared Kushner, one of Trump's in-laws' children? What's going to happen there? Who wins? Family or Bannon? Next.
Trusted name in news.
He understands that we have some pretty smart, talented individuals who are opinionated on a lot of subjects, but that our battles and our policy differences need to be behind closed doors.
President cannot be happy about all this leaking. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer trying to downplay reports of infighting between top Trump officials. You got Jared Kushner, Steve Bannon, you've seen Priebus in there, you've seen Spicer in that mix of people who are being attacked by their own. This follows a report that the president supposedly told Kushner and Bannon to bury the hatchet. Let's discuss with CNN political commentator and contributor to The Hill, Kelly McEnany, and CNN political commentator Ana Navarro. It's good to have you both. Kaylee, let's start off with, as we learn in law school, to argue the premise. Let's attack it. Do you believe any of this? Do you believe that there is legitimate hostility going on between Kushner and Bannon?
Look, I believe there's a grain of truth to it, absolutely. They're definitely ideologically at odds, you know, what Kushner stands for and what Bannon stands for. So, you know, logic would tell you, yes, there probably are disagreements. I think they've been overblown, absolutely, because there's so much palace intrigue. But I definitely think there's disagreements. Look at the Syria strike. We know Bannon was not on board with that ideologically. He's not an interventionist, whereas Kushner and Ivanka, that's more of something that they would have encouraged to much success, I would argue. But I definitely think there are some disagreements.
All right, let's put up this graphic of the assumed camps in the White House, Anna. It really does, with all due respect, shape up like an episode of The Apprentice. You got Team Trump with the president, Ivanka, Jared, Cohn, and Dina Powell in there. You got Team Bannon. A couple of those have already not made the cut. You got Team Priebus, Katie Walsh leaving for her own reasons. Not on this graph, Kellyanne Conway. Where do you think she fits in, and what do you make of this palace intrigue?
Look, there's a little bit of palace intrigue in every palace, including the White House. But this has been a lot, and it's been a lot very early. I'm not sure if we shouldn't, instead of, saying The Apprentice, that to me looks a little bit like House of Cards / the Keystone Cops and Three Stooges, because sometimes they're just running into each other. The first rule of politics is don't air your dirty laundry in public. These folks have been hanging it out from the balcony of the White House. It's a lot of leaking. It's a lot of intrigue. We're not even at 100 days, and we keep hearing about this bloodletting and all this argument going on. It's not good. And, I frankly think Steve Bannon should be treading very carefully, because blood is thicker than water. And even though Kushner is not blood, technically he's as close to blood. He's married to blood. So that counts, too, in Team Trump. Now, I think that for a lot of us who may have issues with Jared Kushner, who is inexperienced, being now the Secretary of Everything, I think we'll stop complaining of the Secretary of Everything. Jared Kushner can somehow get rid of Steve Bannon, who for such a big part of the country is a problematic person in the White House.
Kayla, you're shaking your head. I want to hear why, but also let me give you a little context of what I want you to address with it. The president's in a box. Sure, blood's thicker than water. Everybody knows that. But you don't usually have family surrounding you in the White House, and especially when that family has never done anything like this before at any level, let alone a high level. Somewhat of a box. But that said, Bannon does seem to be a perceived bad boy. How do you see it?
Look, you cannot lose Steve Bannon. You just can't, because, to my knowledge, when I look around the White House, the only person grounding President Trump to keep his promises to the base is Steve Bannon, and perhaps Kellyanne Conway, because you mentioned, which box does she fit in? She might be in that base box, but he needs someone there to say, you cannot renege on your immigration promises, you cannot renege on your free trade economic promises, and Steve Bannon was the guy, before Trump was even on the scene, really, laying the ideological foundation that won over those swing state voters and really won Trump the presidency. You cannot lose Steve Bannon. He is indispensable, and I would be worried
Kayla,
if Steve Bannon was gone.
You know what's interesting? Let's assume you're completely right, and there's a lot of logic to your position. One of the early initiatives when they first got in was something that was about DJT 100, which was this, dream, but, you got to aspire when you're in politics, to get to 100% popularity, to grow way beyond the base. And look at where they are now, Anna. I mean, he is so entrenched with that core group. He has not grown his popularity by any measurable estimate at all. Can he afford to lose Bannon, who is his umbilical connection to the group that got him there?
I think we need to watch what the result and backlash is of the Syria action. For a lot in the base, for a lot in that Steve Bannon faction of the Republican Party, going into Syria, having any activity in Syria was a big no-no. And we saw that President Trump got some backlash from right-wing radio this weekend. Now, the question will be, will they give him wiggle room? Will they allow it? Will they get over it? If they do, I think that sends the message that he has established his own relationship. I think he's got a very strong relationship with that base that surpasses any given advisor. He's quite good at reaching his audience one-on-one.
All right, Anna, Kaylee, appreciate the different perspectives on this, as always. Have a good day. Allison.
All right, just ahead, imagine this on your next flight. A passenger dragged from his seat by airlines officials just because the flight was over.
U.S. war against ISIS is ongoing. CNN was given exclusive access to a KC-10 plane as it refueled Stryker jets. The flight coming just days after Russia suspended communications with the U.S. in protest of the missile strikes and threatened that a confrontation was imminent. CNN's Frederick Pleitgen was on board, joins us now live. Good to see you safe and sound and on the ground. What do you know?
Hi, Chris. Yeah, and there is a lot of tension right now here with the U.S. Air Force flying there over Iraq and Syria, and a lot of uncertainty as well, because there was a system in place before called deconflicting between the Russians and the Americans, and now it seems that system is no longer in place. So what they're doing right now is when they go into Syria, they fly very, very carefully. They obviously look around a lot, but at the same time, Chris, they also say that the fight against ISIS has to continue. Here's what happened to us on our mission.
Faced with new Russian threats, the U.S. military not backing down in the skies over Iraq and Syria. We're on a KC-10 tanker plane refueling the fighters pounding ISIS.
Of course, there's some tension since the Russians have announced they don't want to communicate with the U.S. anymore in the skies over Syria. That's why crews like this one take great care when they fly into Syrian airspace.
Stopping the communications significantly increases the risk of mid-air collisions over this crowded airspace where U.S. coalition and Russian planes operate very close to one another. Russia made the move after America hit a Syrian airfield with cruise missiles last week in response to a chemical attack on a Syrian village, killing around 90 people. Washington blames the Assad regime, Russia's main ally in the civil war there, even as Syria denies being behind the attack. But America doesn't want the turmoil to affect the ongoing effort to destroy ISIS.
Despite the current tensions with Russia, the U.S. says that the fight against ISIS has to continue full steam, especially with American and allied forces on the ground and in harm's way.
A sentiment echoed by commanders leading the air war against ISIS.
We can't take our eye off the ball. That is ISIS. That's why we're here. Our national leadership decided to do something about a problem that they saw, and if we're asked to help out with something like that, we're obviously ready to do it. But right now, ISIS is the game over.
So far, the U.S. says there have been no incidents involving Russian planes over Iraq and Syria, and they hope, despite Russia's rhetoric, that it stays that way.
Our thanks to Fred Pleitgen on that plane that was fueling the jets there, showing how fragile that situation is.
That was great reporting. Meanwhile, we have to tell you about this story that's getting so much attention. Here's a passenger being dragged off of a United Airlines flight because that flight was overbooked by the airline. What was it like to be another passenger on board? We're going to speak with two eyewitnesses who watched all of this.